Usually when people discuss the best stealth games of all time, they bring up the likes of Thief, Hitman and Splinter Cell, or sometimes even slightly sneaky action games like Assassin's Creed and Batman. One game that is almost never brought up is Payday 2 by Overkill Software. Somehow, the shooter where you mow down SWAT teams by the truckload also has a surprisingly good stealthy side to it that even the more dedicated stealth games could learn from. For context, Payday is obviously massively popular and has a huge amount of players who know every tiny detail there is, but I'm not one of those players. I'm someone who's very interested in stealth games and only got into Payday to try out the stealth missions. I went in with fairly low expectations, but as I played it began to click, and now I would call it one of my favorite stealth games of the last decade. It might not be the best and it's probably one of the jankiest, yet it somehow may also be one of the most noteworthy. To those uninitiated, Payday is a game where you rob banks, or museums, or yachts, or trains. Often that involves first disabling the security and sneaking in an excessively elaborate way, and then playing bag-hauling simulator as you escape with the loot. Sometimes you're after one specific item, sometimes everything that isn't nailed down. Usually you want to avoid detection, but sometimes taking hostages might work better. Going in guns blazing is an option too, but I'm interested in the sneaky stuff so I won't get into that. A big part of Payday is co-op, but stealth works just fine in single player as well. Playing solo is more of a challenge as having multiple people moving bags or having someone work as a spotter does make things easier and faster, but only in a couple of heists does not having a partner or a team feel like a real problem. Under perfect conditions I would say that co-op is overall the best way to play, but it requires a good team of patient people and some tolerance for sketchy netcode. Based on my experiences, the netcode can be dealt with just by playing a little more carefully, but your mileage may vary. There's a lot of sneaking to be done, but let's be clear on one thing. Payday isn't like Thief or Hitman. You won't be turning off any lights or distracting guards with coins. By comparison, the ways in which you can interact with the world are extremely limited and there's no pretense of any sort of realism. It's a very arcadey game, and going into it expecting anything even remotely resembling an immersive sim would be a mistake. Take the doors for example. Only the players can open doors, and once they are open they can never be closed again. Some doors can be opened by shooting at the locks with shotguns, which by Payday standards is a very advanced mechanic. Any other interactions are not happening. The guards haven't been blessed with many brain cells either. They behave more like confused Roombas than security experts, walking around randomly and ignoring valuables disappearing around them. They aren't bothered by almost any sounds and are often oblivious to armed robbers running around under their noses. I can understand why people would dismiss Payday's stealth as stupid or bad, because that's what the AI does make it look like, but it kinda works in the arcadey context. It might seem silly that a grown man is effortlessly able to hide behind a tiny tree, and that guards can't hear bags full of gold bars being thrown around, but it also means that there is no ambiguity in whether you can be seen or heard. If you can't see the enemy, they can't see you either, and as long as you stick with silenced weapons, you don't have to worry about making too much noise. Having a grey area where you don't exactly know what the AI can detect is often great for building tension, but has the downside of there being moments when you feel like you get spotted when you shouldn't have. By keeping the rules simple, Payday feels consistently fair and getting spotted feels like your own fault rather than the game cheating. It does come at the cost of tension, but luckily Payday has another way to create exciting moments. This may be the tiniest detail, but the spotting indicator feels like it was designed both to be precise and to keep you on your toes, and I love it. So many games have that generic circular indicator that fails both at building tension because it gives you too much information, and at giving precise information because the indicators are tiny and often lack a clear visual threshold for getting spotted. How does Payday improve on this? Massive indicator, right in the middle of the screen. That's the threshold for getting spotted, can't miss it. Or technically you can, since the very top of the indicator is obscured. In practice, you often see the meter fill up to what looks like the threshold, but still barely avoid detection because there's a little more leeway than it seems. By presenting the same information differently, Payday's indicator generates exciting close call situations rather than disappointing failures. Sure, it's possible I'm reading too much into the UI and the real magic is in the math behind it, but seeing that meter spike up is always thrilling nonetheless. No matter how good the detection indicator is, the player still needs to have some way to locate enemies before any detection happens. Thief does it using footstep sounds, Alien Isolation gives you a motion tracker, and every game since 2009 gives you X-ray vision. I'm not inherently against X-ray vision, as it is a functional tool and depending on what the game is focusing on, it can make sense to keep some aspects simple. Listening for footsteps works great in Thief as sound is a core part of the design, but in Hitman the simple X-ray allows focusing more on disguises and hiding in plain sight. Payday has X-ray despite the very standard line-of-sight based stealth, but I think its take on it is a bit more clever than most. Guards remain marked for X-ray only for a short moment at a time, and then need to be remarked by having a clear line of sight to them. It doesn't sound like much, but it only takes a few seconds to lose track of a guard, so keeping a constant eye on them is still important. Some extra depth comes from indirectly marking guards by using tools like cameras, strip lasers, and my absolute favorite unlockable skill, Sixth Sense. After standing still for a few seconds, Sixth Sense activates and automatically marks enemies within a small radius, even through walls. It actively rewards patience by giving out information, beautifully mixing two key parts of stealth. I know that to some people stealth means knocking out every guard on the map and hitting the point where you can't get spotted because there's no one left to spot you. And I get it. Clearing out the map is often the optimal way to play, so why would you not do it? But personally, I think doing so is removing the stealth from the stealth game, and prefer to have some sort of reason to avoid kills and knockouts. When deleting an enemy requires spending your limited resources, the overall tension remains higher and every encounter becomes more interesting as you have to consider if a guard is worth taking out, or if the resources are better spent elsewhere. In Payday, the most important resource are pagers, which most guards carry. When a guard is killed, his operator will page him and expect a response. If the player does not respond with a dumb excuse in time, the operator will raise the alarm.
I thought I saw a robber, but it was a jogger. They rhyme, so I was confused.
After enough excuses, the operator says he's had enough and raises the alarm anyway. The pager system doesn't make a whole lot of logical sense when you think about it, but again, it works in Payday's arcade context and is mechanically sound, limiting you to only 4 guard kills per heist. You also have a limited number of body bags and zip ties, which are needed for moving bodies and hostages, but those are not as important as pagers. A difficult problem that even the most highly regarded stealth games struggle with is what to do when the player gets detected. A simple mistake can easily escalate into a not-so-stealthy shootout, or a long and boring wait in a dark corner, or being escorted back to the beginning with a score penalty. Those are logical outcomes, but not ideal when the goal is to get back to the fun part, which is sneaking around, and often the most tempting course of action becomes loading the last save. The first time you get spotted during a heist in Payday, the guard doesn't immediately open fire, but instead tries to arrest you and allows you to pull the trigger before things escalate further. It offers a quick path to recovery at the cost of a precious pager, and having to dispose of the body is a good punishment that forces you to actively do something stealthy. It's a small but effective way to minimize the time spent not sneaking around, while still making mistakes have consequences. But that opportunity does not repeat for every subsequent mistake and is often not enough to stop the alarm from being raised. At that point, any notion of stealth goes out the window, the heist switches to the loud path, and unless you're already on your way to the exit, the chances of finishing become slim to none. When there's no recovery and everything goes wrong, Payday sends you all the way back to the beginning of the heist. There are no saves or checkpoints. In Hitman, restarting like that feels awful as you already have a plan figured out up to the point where things went wrong, and restarting means having to repeat the same steps you've already taken. It takes no planning, and the execution is trivial, so all you're left with is boring repetition. That's where Payday's most obvious and probably most important idea comes in. The levels have a lot of random elements from guard patrol patterns to room locations, so every attempt plays out differently. The general map layouts and objectives stay mostly the same, so you can still learn from failed attempts, but starting over stings way less when there's little repetition. Completing a new heist for the first time can be a test of patience that takes hours of attempts, so it's important that each attempt stays compelling. With randomization, Payday manages to avoid both save scumming and mindless repetition, both of which are detrimental to the overall tension. It serves as a great example of a way to stop the game from getting stale when the player makes mistakes, even if it in itself is not something that works for everything. For example, a big part of Hitman's appeal is that the levels are clockworks with repeatable patterns that can be mastered, though the freelancer mode has shown that even Hitman can work with random elements. The downside of randomization is that not all permutations are created equal and the difficulty can be pretty unfair at times. Sometimes the laptop you're looking for is right next to the door it unlocks, other times it could be on a different floor next to some very persistent guards. A ladder that gives you an easy access to the top floor might have a random chance of spawning at all. One of the most difficult bank heists has a 1% chance of the vault door being open, trivializing the whole robbery. Most of the patterns are reasonably balanced, but it does occasionally feel pretty unfair to run into a difficult map layout when you know easier ones exist. I can admit to sometimes resetting after recognizing a particularly unpleasant pattern, even when I knew I could have handled it. What really makes Payday stand out from other stealth games are the crowd control missions. In these heists, your goal isn't to avoid detection entirely, but to take over a small area and keep the situation contained within it. Civilians can be yelled at and taken hostage in any mission if they're present. It's just rarely important as they're even dumber than the guards and usually few in numbers. But in a full-on hostage situation where you can't avoid detection and don't have enough zip ties to subdue everyone, remaining in control becomes a different challenge. The more threatening you appear, the less likely the civilians are to do anything stupid like call for help. Suddenly the minigun starts to seem like a pretty good stealth weapon. Or the buzzsaw, which also doubles as a lockpick. These heists only have very few guards in them, so running out of pages isn't a concern and the guards can be picked off one at a time before the takeover. And that's how it typically goes. You case the joint, quietly thin out the security, and when you're feeling good about your chances, rush in to scare everyone and take control. If the alarm doesn't go off in the next 20 seconds, you can breathe again as the rest of the heist is mostly looting the place while making sure nobody tries to be a hero. It's a novel take on stealth that hasn't been done in games before and at best feels like a scene from a movie. Unfortunately, that novelty doesn't last for long and in practice, the whole thing feels somewhat half-baked. There are only a handful of proper crowd control missions, and all of them have their issues. In the generic bank heist, the initial setup and takeover are simple and good, but clearing the vault is a tedious chore. In Go Bank, random events spice things up while waiting for the vault to open, but randomly spawning pedestrians can trigger the alarm from outside the playable area. In No Mercy, the takeover needs to be very quick and coordinated, but soon after that the alarm gets triggered anyway, making stealth impossible. The Diamond Store heist is maybe the most functional of the crowd control heists, but that's not a high bar to reach. I desperately want these heists to be good because they're a real breath of fresh air, but ultimately they tend to be some of Payday's less enjoyable missions. They're still worth trying out because they have some of the most original stealth ideas I've seen in a long time, even if the execution falls a bit short. I can only hope that the concept receives a bit more love in Payday 3. On the topic of bad stuff, Payday does have some glaring issues, especially if you're new to the game. The difficulty and quality of the heists varies greatly, there's no logical place to start from, and the game itself fails to list the stealth heists accurately. Technically there is a campaign, but if you're after the stealth gameplay, it's not the right place to look. My personal recommendation would be to start by doing the stealth tutorial, then move on to Shadow Raid and Murky Station, which are some of the simpler heists. After getting the hang of the basics, try out any of the heists and see how they feel, without necessarily expecting to finish them right away. For convenience, here's a list of heists in roughly the order in which I would recommend trying them. The loadout system is another sad swamp one must sink into when starting out. It's clear that the skill tree, weapon customization, perk decks, and crew abilities are designed mostly for loud builds, because for stealth they're a mere speed bump on the way to having everything set up. The skill tree does have some very helpful skills in it, but outside of maybe having a dedicated crowd control build, there's no real customization to be seen. Early on reputation levels rack up quickly, and soon enough there comes a point when there are more skill points to spend than meaningful skills to spend them on. As for the difficulty options, the differences between normal and death sentence aren't huge and mostly boil down to the number of guards. If you're feeling comfortable with the gameplay, I wouldn't hesitate to crank up the difficulty pretty quickly. If anything, I'd say most of the difficulty comes from the way the game taps into your own sense of greed. The objective might be to steal just 6 bags of money, but when the vault is already open, why not take everything? Stealing more is tempting, but every extra bag increases the chances of making a mistake and getting caught. The reward doesn't even really matter, it's more of a ratio between risk and professional pride. Something that can't be ignored when talking about Payday 2 is what a DLC hellscape it is. In 2017, Overkill released the Ultimate Edition that included all the released DLC for a much more reasonable price, and promised that all DLC from then on would be free. Unfortunately, their next game, Overkill's The Walking Dead, flopped so hard that they scrapped it from their website, and in 2019 they started pushing out more paid Payday DLC instead. The Ultimate Edition got rebranded as the Legacy Collection and is still a decent deal, but understandably a lot of fans were upset by the broken promises. I don't really mind there being new paid heists and would go as far as to say that the ones I've tried have been pretty good, but they're still hard to recommend. Even though the randomization adds replay value, we're not talking about Hitman missions here, and €7 feels quite high for a single Payday heist. More disappointingly, I don't feel like the new DLCs have actually added anything new to the game. The heists themselves might be fine, but they don't bring in any new ideas and have started to feel stale. The whole crowd control aspect seems to have gotten completely forgotten too. Whether it's technical limitations preventing any major additions or Overkill just wanting to play it safe when milking their cash cow, the new DLCs aren't exactly exciting. But hey, Payday 3 is supposedly around the corner, so maybe they're saving the new ideas for that one. Admittedly, I'm not filled with optimism given that Overkill's latest releases are formulaic DLCs and The Walking Dead, and that some of the people left the studio and moved on to make the very good GTFO, but I'll keep my fingers crossed anyway. Despite its flaws, Payday 2 is still easily on my arbitrary list of top stealth games. The randomization allows it to be more challenging than most without getting stale, it's got some great smaller details like the tension meter and sixth sense, and the crowd control missions are probably the most original take on stealth since camouflages in Metal Gear Solid 3. Even though on the surface it might look like a goofy attempt at shoehorning stealth into a shooter, I still think it manages to be the most innovative stealth game of the previous decade. And that's not a slight against any other games, many of which I'd consider better than Payday in their own ways. Payday simply is the one that adds the most new ideas to the genre, and for that deserves praise. It's not the first game I'd recommend to someone new to the genre, but to stealth veterans looking for something out of the ordinary, it's a damn solid choice.